Okay, we have a variety of topics today, but maybe I'll just go ahead and start with the first question, which is really about building community. So I guess my question is, maybe we could talk about what are some effective ways to support junior developers in the Ruby community. And when I was thinking about this question, I thought maybe we can split this up. There's two branches. One is how do you support junior developers who are, say, on your teams already writing Ruby? And the other is how do you bring more developers, let's say people who might not be in the Ruby community yet? How do you bring more developers to become junior developers in the Ruby community? Maybe let's see who looks excited to answer. Let's start with Selena, maybe.
Sure, no problem. Well, let's start with juniors on your team. The best thing you can do for juniors on your team. If anyone was at RubyConf Thailand last year, you'll know that I'm a huge fan of pair programming. Pair programming is the way to absolutely accelerate your juniors and help them to grow and to learn new skills. And I think that is the best thing that we can possibly do for them, is give them as much time as possible.
Yeah, thank you. And I do remember that pair programming talk. I think it's on YouTube, and it's quite interesting to watch. So I think definitely recommend it. Ellie, what do you think?
Okay, so I've to be clear, I've run two associate developer programs, upskilling junior developers into becoming better. I think the best thing that you can do, I agree with pair programming. I also think that you need to set them up for success. That means onboarding them properly, supporting their training as they come on. That could be a set programs that you develop, or just have people to pair program with them, develop some materials or think of how you can bring them on board, give them tickets that they can work on that fits their skills. Don't think that you only need to have seniors to support juniors. Mids are as good as well, because they haven't been so far removed from being a junior, so they still remember how it is to be a junior, and they can answer questions properly. Pair them with a buddy so they can come to somebody and talk to them when they have problems. Just a few things.
Thanks, Ellie. And are there any sort of consistent obstacles that you see junior programmers run into when you're thinking about setting them up for success? Are there any sort of consistent problems that we should be aware of?
Yeah, so setting expectations of what you expect them to achieve. They usually try to be very valuable and contribute to the team, and sometimes it's hard to say, actually, you don't have to run. You just need to focus on your education and your learning, and also communicate that if they are blocked, they should ask for help, because a lot of time they get stuck and they don't communicate that they are stuck.
Thanks. Gemma?
Yeah, just to tack on to that last point a bit, something I think about quite actively is modeling behavior. We were all once juniors, we were all once new to programming, and certainly new to Ruby, and I think it's easy to forget those things as you become more experienced. The number one thing I try to model is saying when I don't know and asking questions when I don't know. I think all too often juniors are in positions where they feel like the best way to impress those around them is to know, or that they should know even when they don't. And that's where you can run into the situation that Ellie was referencing, where they're not asking questions, they're not asking for help because they think you know everything, and therefore they think they should know everything, or at least make it appear as though they know everything. So really just modeling that behavior around not knowing and asking for help when appropriate.
So one thing I think that remote work has been really bad for junior developers. So definitely one thing you can do is try to get people back in the office. I'm kind of in a world where I don't know if that's ever going to be possible again. It seems to be kind of permanent, but I definitely felt much better about mentoring developers when we're there, right? You have that serendipity of just being in the same place. But also I was trying to give junior developers something that's some easy tasks, not easy, but tasks that are within their limit, but then also some tasks that are just a little past it, right? Where they maybe don't quite have all the skills quite yet, and they need to ask for a little help, just challenge people. And I always like to, we do a lot of like Zoom calls and things with other teams or Slacking with other teams, and I really try to get them to like do their own, some like communication with other teams and like sort of start off these architectural meetings, even if I have to, step in and chat, just get them doing their own like inter-team communication and things like that. I feel like if people like learn to communicate and talk about their solutions, that they form better just conceptions of what they're building and things like that.
I want to add a couple more things to what Gemma and Brett said. When you teach someone, you have a place when they are comfortable and they're not learning, a place when you stretch them a little bit, but they're learning along the way, and a place when you drop them in the deep side of the pool and when it's like everything's on fire and they can't deal. You want to be in a place when you stretch them just a little bit and they're learning along the way rather than plateauing on where they are. With communication and supporting them and showing that you don't know everything, ask them to ask questions. Ask them to ask why. And also when you give them work, we like to do something that's called code previews, because once they get to a point when they put a pull request in, it's already too late. They committed to a solution. Whereas if you do a code preview, you talk through some options and you can guide them to make the right decision, and then they go ahead and work on something that you both agreed is right. So when they get to a code review stage, you just need to tweak it a little bit. You don't have to restart from scratch.
I like that idea. I do sometimes get the impression that developers submitting a pull request, it's almost like I'm submitting my homework, I'm going to get graded now. Selena, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to add on, we've talked a lot about communication and getting these juniors to speak up and say when they've got a problem or when they're struggling. But obviously that comes back even further to the culture in your company and making it so that you have an environment where people are able to feel vulnerable and are able to say, hey, I don't know what's going on or I don't understand. So it even comes back beyond just dealing with juniors directly. It's what is the culture of the whole organization and the whole engineering team.
Thanks. Actually, I wanted to touch on something that you mentioned, Brad, which is the idea of remote work. And I find that in my own company, I struggle with this as well, and that there's this sort of like paradox of attitudes that on one hand, like people love remote work, they want to be able to work from home. On the other hand, people, when they are together, I see that teams enjoy being around each other. I'm curious how all of you in the context of your organizations, how you've sort of balanced or solved or not solved this.
I'm constantly bugging my manager for more on-sites so we can all travel to Austin and meet up. It's expensive and they don't like to do it, but I just feel like getting people in the same cities, they really helps.
Yeah, that's good. Where I work at Fresho in Australia, we've gone fully remote with engineering. We previously, prior to COVID, we were all in the office. It was a great time, a lot of fun, a lot of interactions. But the way that we're set up and we're structured is that we're 100% pair programming. So we're highly collaborative. And even though we're fully remote, we're remote from the same time zone, so we're all working the same hours. And we've leveraged tools like Tuple, which allow us to pair remotely, so no one's ever by themselves. They're highly collaborative. You turn on your camera when you're on this remote session, because obviously some of the issue with remote is dead silence and you don't know what's happening with the other person if you're pairing. So cameras on really helps with that. We do try to get together in person maybe 4 times a year, and the focus for that is really more around collaboration and teamwork and team building exercises so that we can be comfortable and vulnerable and be able to work together nicely.
Yeah, I think one way I think about it pretty strongly is to distinguish between types of work that are good for remote work and types of work that are good to do when you're doing these get-togethers. I think for me, things like strategy and bigger picture thinking and things that just come up in a conversation at dinner, or, oh, what about if this interacted with this? Those are all better for the in-person time. And then for me personally, I find it quite draining actually to be with people all day when I'm programming or working on something. And then when I go to the bathroom, I get distracted into a different conversation and out of a headspace. So I love remote work as a time where I can focus on coding or pairing or things that require a bit more of these large chunks of attention. And I really like the in-person meeting for the bigger picture, more strategic, more project planning thinking. And I like to think of it in terms of those divisions as it works for me.
So I think going and meeting people in person does create relationships and connections that you can't get when you are online. But there are limitations with that. It means being less flexible for people with families or people they care about. It's also a bit difficult for people that are neurodivergent or people that are more introvert and find it very taxing to be in the company of other people in the office. So I think if you still are working remotely, you need to create opportunities for people to still connect and talk and not just about work. So they learn about their coworkers and learn who they are so they can relate to them later on when they work together.
Thanks. I guess maybe we should move on to the next question, or do you want to continue on this thread? Actually, I wanted to ask about the other dimension of this, which is how do you bring more developers into the Ruby community? Like not just the existing junior developers on your team, but I think that like a previous speaker stated, Ruby is now more stable. It may not be the language that's getting all the blog posts, but that's not necessarily a bad thing either. But any thoughts on how do you bring more, let's say, junior developers or developers in general to want to join the Ruby community?
So the Ruby community in Australia 12 years ago. So we used to do Rails camps regularly, twice a year, which is a weekend away. Think of like an unconf in a place that at the time didn't have any internet, and people had to actually ask the person next to them for help because you couldn't just Google the answer. But one of the Rails camp we had, there was 125 people in the camp, and I was the only woman that was at that camp. And this is when the community actually raised the issue of what do we do about getting more women into the Ruby community. And the things that helped at the time is you started having dev bootcamps, and we started running Rails Girls workshops to train women in introduction to Ruby. And you also worked on the culture of the community to be more welcoming to women and juniors as well. I know this is what worked for the Ruby Australia community. I'm not sure about other countries.
Yeah, I can speak to this and thinking around, especially I think the point you're making that is incredibly important is as we're getting more people into the community, making sure we continue to grow the diversity of our community and that it doesn't just continue to reflect the demographics that already exist within it. This was a lot of the reason I founded WMB.RB. Retention specifically of people of color and of gender minorities within programming communities tends to be a lot less. And as you alluded to, having community is really helpful. Coming to events like this is really helpful. I think especially because it gives you a longevity outside of just the company, right? So if you have, say you tried to begin programming and you started a job and you really didn't like the job or the coworker or something and you had no community outside of that company, then as soon as you leave, you're tempted to just leave that industry or that field or that language. I think for me at least, creating communities outside of specific companies that keep people involved in the language, not as they relate to one job is really critical, and making sure we're really modeling behaviors again, that we think are important around inclusion and things like that, and how are we thinking about those is something that's important.
Yeah, so you need people to see that they are role models they need to see themselves in the community. So if women look at a big room and only see men, they're going to be a bit more confronted, and they will find it a harder time to join that community. So they need to see other people that are like them in the community that being welcomed.
Thank you. I want to move on to our next question. Thank you very much. And I think that you're right. Like having that inclusiveness is very, very important. I just want to move on to our next question. It's 2023, so we have to talk about AI, especially in the context of Ruby. So maybe we'll just start with this: is how do you foresee generative AI or AI in general affecting the future of programming? Let's say in general or in Ruby.
I think it's already saved us $4 or $5 million. We estimate that people are 30% faster using GitHub Copilot. We have, but people only spend about half their time programming, so that's a 15% improvement, right? We have 500 engineers, so times 15%. We just got basically 75 developers for free. So it's fantastic savings. I'm all for it. I think it's amazing. Honestly, I think programming is still too hard. I've spent, like last week, I spent like a whole day on one like silly little task, right? Just to like fix some time zone issue. Like it shouldn't be that hard. We all spend way too much brain power doing things that should be a lot easier. So I think our new robot overlords are going to be great. I'm kind of interested because I'm wondering if programming languages evolve or if new programming languages are going to come out that are specifically sort of optimized for language models to understand them better, right? If you look at Ruby with like all the like the mix-ins and the inheritance and the meta-programming, right? It's not very explicit compared to something like a Haskell, like a functional languages. And so I'm really curious to see if this kind of spawns a new breed of tools that work better that are more optimized for AI workflows.
That's really interesting. It'll be good to see what happens as AI advances. Hopefully it means that we don't need to spend all of our time kind of focusing on minutiae and we can really focus on the core problems. But it's kind of interesting. So I don't have an extensive background in computer science. I kind of came in later in life and further down the track and more into Ruby. And the people that I work with who have been coding for 20 years, they've got this really deep, low-level kind of understanding of how things work. And people, now we've got more like boot camps, for example, in Australia, and these programs to try and fast track people to get them into the industry sooner. And a lot of people who do these Ruby boot camps, they come in without that core kind of low-level understanding. And now we're starting to move to things like Copilot, which makes it even more accessible for people to get on the tools and start putting together, working software. But it'll be interesting to see whether that means down the track, these people are coming in even further up the stack with less of that low-level kind of knowledge, and are we going to potentially lose out on something there in the future?
Yeah, good point. Do you think that most of the, I guess, influence of AI is on the side of tooling, or do you also think that there'll be other changes in how we approach problems?
So like I said, I think that tooling needs to evolve to be more AI friendly. There's an interesting issue that you kind of alluded to. When you're higher up the stack, right, and you have less, it's very possible to have AI like write your methods and then you copy and paste them into your classes, right, or have them kind of generated there, but you don't really gain a full conception of how your program works. So I'm wondering if we're moving towards like this era where it kind of becomes too easy for junior developers to make something that works 90% correctly, and then to not have like the debugging skills to actually figure it out because they didn't go through sort of the thought exercise of really organizing their code right in a clear way. They kind of delegated that out. It's kind of odd because it's like a new level of compilation having AI, but it's a non-deterministic compiler where you get different outputs every time you ask. So there are unsolved challenges. I don't know. I don't know if I really answered your question, but there's some interesting weird challenges here that didn't exist before. Like airflows, right? Like you can easily have AI like write a whole bunch of functions, but then you haven't really thought about how like the exception handle, like the exceptions flow, right? And if you're not already a senior dev and you haven't done that before, you may skip it entirely and get something that mostly works, but not entirely.
I completely agree. In a way, Copilot can write your program for you, but you still need to review it. And unless you know what it's supposed to be doing, like you have no idea whether it works or not, or what you might be missing.
Yeah, another dimension I've thought about a bit with AI is that most of the AI companies, as far as I know and as far as I've learned about them, use Python primarily. And I've been thinking recently about the future of Ruby, right? We know these AI companies are going to continue to grow. Should we be trying to figure out ways that we can structure Ruby, or we can make changes to Ruby to make it an enticing option for AI companies to be using, as opposed to Python? And I've been thinking kind of on the dimension of what does it mean for the Ruby community if all of these companies and all of this tech is mostly written not in Ruby, and is there an angle there? And I don't know the answers there, but I think that's one implication, at least for our community, that's really been on my mind.
Yeah, I remember when there was a lot of work in Python going on in this. There was also another set of Ruby libraries. They never got very popular. I can't remember the name right now, but it was essentially a re-implementation of pandas. And one thing I thought was, like, is there value in this? Besides, like, okay, we should get people into our language and not the other language or something like that. But, you know, obviously, is there additional value that we could gain from doing this type of work in Ruby versus in Python, or, you know, another language or another set of tools?
Right. Yeah. It's also the thing about it continuing to be in Python is Python will get more resources towards its ecosystem, because it'll end up fueling much more of AI and of the programs we're using than Ruby. Ruby's ecosystem, I would imagine, will drain the way it's headed with AI.
I think that when I look at the tasks I do every day, it seems like the sort of next evolution of great tools and capabilities that we get aren't really coming from programming languages anymore. They're coming from managed services. Like, you know, I'm far more excited when AWS, you know, introduces some new managed hosted service that helps my life way more than, like, sort of, oh, I could try the next new programming language. And that's a shift that's been happening for a while. But then I'm also interested to see if these cloud service providers also make it sort of like easier to sort of set these things up, right? Using sort of language models. Like, it's easy for me to write two services and have one post to another, or use Kafka. But it's still a pain. It's still a huge hassle to, like, set up SSL between those two services, you know? So if there's a way they could make that easier, so I could just tell the model, hey, connect SSL, and sort of have the programming languages more tightly integrated with the cloud services, and better declarative languages for the cloud services that are more closely connected with the AI, that would really increase our, you know, productivity.
Thanks, Brad. You've given me an interesting segue to our next question, especially when you think about not only the power of AI and the power of all of the modern cloud services. I think that one of the results that we see is each individual engineer now has a lot more scope underneath them. And so my next question is, how do you think developers, Ruby developers in particular, can avoid burnout and maintain some kind of a sustainable work-life balance, especially now that I think that we've seen over the, let's say, last 20 years that really the entire scope of a single person has grown enormously. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if it's specific to Ruby developers, but in general, you need to have other things kind of going on, right? You can't just go 100% all day, every day, hardcore in the code. You need something else. What I've done in the past, I have taken on sports activities where I can finish work at the end of the day and I can switch off and focus on something else. And by having this other hobby or something completely different to focus on outside of work and outside of working on code, you can be more present when you're there, and more effective in learning and understanding and knowing what's going on when you're there and you're on the tools and you're learning these new things. It's interesting that you say that you know, people have a lot more to keep in their head now, because we've got a lot more kind of generalists. People are full stack. People are You can't just do back end, you've got to do back end, and you've got to do some front end, and you've got AI to compete with, and you need to keep up to date with all the latest technologies. I mean, when we come back to sort of juniors and people getting started, one of the key things that you say to them is focus on one thing at a time, right? Focus on one thing. Once you're confident with that, start thinking about another thing. So I think trying to cut back the scope to focus on one thing at a time and having some kind of outlet to switch off.
I think that sometimes it's hard to have a break from work when your leadership and your company's asking you to do more and more work and don't role model the behavior that you want to see. So if your boss wants everything done yesterday, then it's very hard to say no. So one, you need the culture in the company to role model the behavior that you want to see, but you also, for yourself, need to define your priorities and manage up, like build a relationship with your manager and communicate your needs and set boundaries for what you need.
I think one thing to note also as it relates to our prior conversation is that this has become a lot more difficult with remote work, right? It used to be the case that the office was the office and home was home, and now those lines, I think, for almost all of us are most certainly blurred. And people I've seen really succeed at keeping a distinction still when they're working remotely or working from home, still impose that distinction, right? I've seen methods as kind of wild as people putting sheets over their monitors when the workday is done. So they're not tempted to go back to the office that happens to be in the living room that's right there just after you're done eating dinner to go back to. And so I think thinking about, I'm sure we've all been living in this world for a few years now. I'm sure everyone has their own strategies. But in terms of what works for me to switch to work being done is to really close it and leave my office in a way that I'm not just going to return to because I'm at home doing something else.
I've definitely struggled with that issue. I had to move my coffee pot from the kitchen into my office, so I couldn't leave. That's a good tactic. In general, work-life balance, right? Exercise, right? Punching over your keyboard like this is bad for your shoulders and your neck and things like that. You know, exercise when you're young. Use a standing desk. I do think that you should have some times in your career where you are immersed in work and you don't have work-life balance. I think that the times where I really developed, right, and really accomplished the best things I've accomplished in my career, I was not balanced at all. I was fully immersed in work, and I did burn out, and I think that's okay. I wouldn't have done it another way. You know, everyone's got different life circumstances. That's harder to say, harder for some of us than others. But I don't know. That's all. I just read the Elon Musk biography, and he's a machine, and that's.
I was going to say, is that sort of like the what does Elon call it, like monster mode or something like that? Yeah.
Forget work-life balance. We've got spaceships to launch, right? I think you need a stage in your life like that.
Yeah, but at the same time, monster mode isn't good for everybody around you either. So
I think to your point, it's different for different people. I certainly need outlets. In fact, I actually find I do my best work on runs or hikes or swimming or things like that when my mind is just free and I'm not even thinking about work, and then something comes into my head that I hadn't necessarily thought of. And I find for me, the very few times in my life I've tried to pull really long days, I just have nothing. I'm coming up with nothing, and it's useless for me. That's not my productive mode at all. And I think probably never will be. And so I think realizing that, again, especially to your point, if you're managing or leading teams or have people below you, thinking about how you're modeling behavior and how those behaviors might not work for everyone on your team.
100%, sorry. 100% resonate with that. I've had many times the experience where I finish work at the end of the day and there's this problem and I haven't been able to solve it, and I keep thinking about it, and then I have dinner and I keep thinking about it, and I go to bed and I can't sleep for the whole night. And the next day I'm wrecked and I'm completely useless. And all I really needed to do was go to the gym or go do some other activity or something else to completely switch off from it. And if I'd have done that, I'd probably have a good night's sleep and wake up with the answer in the morning. Because I've had those experiences as well, right?
I was just thinking about burnout the other week, and I started writing a blog post about that. And what I said in that is that usually when I think a burnout happens is when you have a gap between expectations and reality. When I try to work harder to close that gap, and as I try to do that, I don't look after myself and my boundaries. So I think if it's good to know what your signs and symptoms for burnout is, so you can be aware when that happens and start working against that, start working to counteract that.
Thanks, everybody. One last question, because I know that everybody's been super excited about this conference, about all the speakers. And it's something, personally, I have never done anything myself in a conference of this size or of a large size. What would you recommend? What are some tips or advice you have for people who would like to present at a Ruby conference or at any large conference?
So many tips. Oh my God, I've got so many. Number one, start simple. Start off really small. Do some, come up with some topics, do some practice runs. Maybe where you work, maybe you can do like a 10 or 15 minute tech talk. Maybe you can go to your local Ruby community. You can do some practices. You can get feedback. You can, improve on your talk, do some different iterations. Maybe look into lightning talks. So RubyConf this year doesn't have lightning talks, but some conferences do offer lightning talks. So 7 to 15 minutes is obviously less daunting if you're trying to get into it for the first time. But when it comes to the content itself, keep it really simple. Pick one topic and like 3 key takeaways. Really, really simple, because, after 2 days, we're so excited to hear all these technical talks and great talks, but it's tiring, right? So if everyone's got heaps of content packed in, people maybe aren't going to take so much away. So just focus on your core message. 2 more things. Number 1, practice. Practice as much as you can. Number 2, this one maybe is a bit risky for your first talk, but conferences love live demos. Woo! And live code. And if you're really interested and really game, like I said, I'm really keen on pair programming. I'm also really keen on pair presenting. You can find actually a talk I gave last week about how to do pair presentations, because sometimes just having somebody else to bounce off gives you a bit of confidence, although that is a bit of a step up as well.
I will put in a quick plug here. For those of you who live in Thailand, we hold the Bangkok RB holds the Ruby meetup every month, and it's a good opportunity to practice speaking in front of people.
So before the pandemic, I used to speak at like 6 conferences a year or so. I figured out that my acceptance rate was about 15%. So to get 6 speaking gigs a year, I had to apply to 40 conferences, which is exactly what I did. And that's how I got more. I'm kind of lucky in that I've got a pretty diverse skill set, so I was able to apply to like Elixir conferences and JavaScript conferences and Postgres conferences and functional programming conferences, because there aren't that many Ruby conferences. So if you really want to focus on just Ruby or something, it's a little harder. But really the key to getting accepted, I think, is writing the perfect paragraph for your abstract, right? Make it really clear what you're going to present, make it novel, appeal to multiple audiences, right? Whether you're a beginner or an expert, this talk is great for you, right? Explain why people should come to this talk. Conference organizers, they like to don't make it too vague, right? They like to know what they're getting, right? So write that paragraph, use strong verbs, right? Active voice, use all those English writing skills, or if you're not a native English speaker, just use ChatGPT, right? I'm kidding. But it's about that like perfect paragraph.
AI is going to take away our conference organizers too.
A couple of things. So first, coming up with a topic can be very daunting. So one suggestion is just try, without thinking too much, write 10 things that you are good at, or that you know, or that you've worked on last week or last month. Like using examples from your actual work and pulling ideas from there is great. And then pick 1 or 2 and develop that more. How to write CFPs or proposals. There's quite a lot of resources online. Ruby Central has been running sessions to help you with tips on how to write CFPs. So you can sign up to their sessions to learn about that. When you write a CFP, try to imagine the perfect world. Think of the problems that people will have and then the perfect world where they want to be at, and use that to develop your pitch. Practice small, where you feel comfortable, and ask for feedback on your presentations from people.
Gemma, I'll let you have the last word. I think somebody might be excited to get to lunch.
Yeah, one more resource to plug. Nadia Odonayu built a website called speakerline.io, which just has heaps of CFPs and whether they've been accepted or rejected. If you've written CFPs, please add yours there, but that's really helpful to see what CFPs look like. My biggest advice would just be to start applying. I've heard so many people say they need to be expert or they're waiting till this happens until they start applying to talk. There are a ton of beginners in the audience. Beginner talks are really helpful for those beginners in the audience. Some of my favorite talks are just about how arrays work, or some method on array that they didn't know, or solving some bug. Like, if you're in this room, you have more than enough experience to give a talk, and my biggest advice would just be to start applying if it's something that interests you.
Yeah, sorry. Two more things. Yes. So when I started giving talks, I was in the Sydney Ruby community, and I thought, oh my God, everybody here knows so much more than me. What can I tell them? But you need to remember that sometimes as you learn, there's other new people that know less than you. So what you know, they don't know, and they need to hear it. And second, yes, I do love to do live coding on stage, but it is also problematic. So if that frightens you, don't do it.
It's high risk for sure.
Okay. Well, I think we'll need to wrap up, but thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for participating on the panel. Thank you for your talks, or looking forward to your upcoming talk this afternoon. I think that's it for today. So, yeah, Matt?
Okay.